To create your own titles and graphics in Blender to use with the program pack can be a bit complicated, but with some practice, you'll find it fairly easy. This is the longest of the tutorial series and uses not only Blender, but Gimp as well. We'll start with simple titles and move on from there. Start with a new Blender scene. If you're already in Blender, save your work, then press Ctrl-N and select Reload Startup File. At the top of the screen, select Cycles Render. The fisheye camera won't work with the Blender internal or Blender game rendering engines. Go over to the Render tab and set the parameters for the file. Set the X and Y sizes to the desired settings. For this, let's go with 2560 by 2560, rendered at 100%. Scroll down to Output and select PNG under File Format. Make sure that RGBA is selected so the final file will have an alpha channel. Find the Film tab and click the Transparent box. This will give us our alpha channel, so we can easily overlay our titles on the background images. In the 3D view, right-click on the default cube and press X to delete it. Press Shift-A and select Text. For easier editing of the text, press 7 on the numeric keypad, or select Top under the View menu at the bottom left of the screen. To edit the text, press Tab. Change the text, then press Tab again to exit the edit mode. At the right of the screen, open the Object Data tab for text. The icon for it looks like the letter F. You may choose to use the default font, but your titles will probably look much better if you select a different font. Click the icon that looks like a file folder next to Regular in the Font submenu. You can go to the Fonts directory on your computer. Here are the default locations where you can find the fonts directories for Windows, Mac OS X, and Linux. You can also select a font you've downloaded into another directory. Just be careful that the font you've selected isn't subject to certain copyrights. If you wish to see what a font looks like before you select it, click the third icon for a thumbnail view under the display mode at the top of the file selector window. In this example, because I'm using a Windows computer, I'm going to select Arial Bold. Select your font and press Enter, or click Open Font at the top right of the screen. We're just about finished with the Object Data tab. But before we move on, select Center for the horizontal alignment in the Paragraph submenu. We want this text to stand out, so we're going to make it emit its own light. To do this, we have to assign a material to the text. Just to the right of the Object Data icon for text, you'll see an icon that looks like a little ball. This is the Materials tab. Click on it. The only material available is the default material, so click New. By default, the material produced is Diffuse BSDF for the shader type. What we need is an emission shader. Click on that box and select Emission Shader. You can change the color by clicking on the color swatch and selecting from the color wheel. For this example, we're going to go with full white, so move the slider on the right all the way to the top. We're going to repeat the steps we took for creating the first piece of text, but we'll make some slight changes. Again, with the mouse pointer over the 3D view, press Shift-A and select Text. Press Tab to edit the text, and press Tab again when you're finished editing. Move the text down from the first line of text by pressing G, Y, then moving the mouse until it's where you want it. Left-click or press Enter to lock in the change. Open the Object Data tab again to select a font. You can either select a new font or use the font we originally selected by clicking on the F at the left end of the font selector. Let's do that. Set the horizontal alignment to center. One thing that we'll do differently is that we're going to make this text slightly larger. Under the Font menu, click in the Size Entry box and enter 1.2. We're going to assign the same material to this text object as we did to the other, so enter the Materials tab. Instead of clicking New, click the ball icon on the left side of the Material Selection box and click on Material .001, which is the material we created earlier. We need to put the text into position for rendering. Right-click on the first text item. While holding the Shift key, right-click on the second text item. You can now move them as if they were one object. Let's rotate them 90 degrees along the x-axis by pressing R, X, 90, and Enter. To see the text from the front, press 1 on the numeric keypad or select Front from the View menu. You can also rotate around the view by holding down the middle mouse button and moving the mouse around. From the front view, move the text up and down by pressing GZ, then moving the mouse until the text is centered. Press Enter or left-click the mouse to lock in the change. For the text to be seen by the camera, we need to move it away from the center of our scene. Do this by pressing G, Y, 10, and Enter. If we placed our camera now and rendered the frame, we'd only see the top half of the text because it's right on the horizon. We need to rotate it into its final position. Start by making sure the 3D cursor is in the center of our scene. The easiest way to do this is to press Shift-S and select Cursor to Center. We're going to rotate our text around this point. To do this, find the Pivot Center for Rotation Scaling at the bottom of the screen. Click on this and select 3D Cursor. With the mouse pointer over the 3D window, rotate the text into position by pressing R, X, and a numeric value. 0 is straight ahead and 90 is directly overhead. 45 is a good value for now. Remember to press Enter or left-click to lock in the value. Reset the pivot center to median point. Right-click the camera object to select it. We're going to place it at the center of the scene and rotate it to point directly upward, the same way we'd set up a fisheye camera in the real world if we wanted to capture the sky. Press Alt-G to reset its position at the center of the scene. Press Alt-R to reset its rotation to 0 on all axes. To point it directly up, press R, X, 180 and press Enter. With the camera still selected, look for the Camera Object Data tab. It looks like a picture of an old-fashioned movie camera. To turn this into a fisheye camera, click Panoramic under the lens setting. Under Type, select Fisheye Equidistant. If you use one of the other types of fisheye lenses, it won't work for this project. Now you're almost ready to render. Remember to save your work from time to time by pressing Ctrl-S. You can now render your image by either going to the Render tab and selecting Render, or pressing F12. You'll see your image rendering in the main window. Hover the mouse pointer over this window and press Shift-Home if you want to see the full image. Once it has stopped rendering, you can press F3 to save your image. Make sure that the file type is PNG and the output type is RGBA. You can now import this image into the video sequence editor and use it the same as you would any other image with an alpha channel. Creating graphics to use on the dome is quite a bit more complicated, especially if you're using something that has already been produced, such as a JPEG or other type of file. If you don't need any part of it to be transparent, that's considerably easier. But if you want to use your facility's logo or an image from a sponsor, you'll need to prepare for that first. Let's start simply and work our way up from that. We can use the scene from the titles tutorial. Open it, then right-click the two text items. Delete these. Use the Save As option from the File menu and give this a new file name. Also under the File menu, find the User Preferences menu and open it. Click on the Add-ons tab. Next to the little magnifying glass icon, type in Image. You'll see a couple options to the right. Select Import, Export, Import Images as Planes. Click Save User Settings at the bottom left of this box, then close it. This will allow you to import images in the future without the need to go through this step again. With your mouse pointer over the 3D view, press Shift-A. At the top of the pop-up menu, put the mouse pointer over Mesh. A submenu will open. Select Images as Planes. A file menu will open. Find the image you wish to import and select it. In the 3D window, you'll see a gray rectangle that represents your image. Press Alt-G and Alt-R to null out any location or rotation settings it may have. That will make it easier to work with. If you open the Materials Properties tab, you'll see that it has been assigned a mixed material of transparent and diffuse. If your image is a PNG, that transparency will work. However, if it's a JPEG file, we'll have to create a transparency mask, which we'll do later. For now, we just want to turn this from a diffuse object to an emission object. Click where it reads Diffuse BSDF and change that to Emission. Now we need to scale and place our image so it can be seen. Let's make it twice as big by pressing S, 2, and Enter. Rotate it 90 degrees along the x-axis, just like we did with our text objects earlier, by pressing R, X, 90, Enter. Move it off the center of the scene by pressing G, Y, 8. Finally, we're going to rotate it into position by making sure the 3D cursor is at the center of the scene and setting the pivot point to the 3D cursor. Let's put it a bit higher on the dome by pressing RX60, Enter. To really mix things up a bit, let's move it from the center to the left by pressing RZ35, Enter. If you wanted to put it on the right instead, you'd use -35 as your numeric value. By changing the X and Z rotation values, you can put your image anywhere on your dome. Just be sure to do them in that order, otherwise strange things can happen. As we saw earlier, if our image has an alpha channel, that transparency will be imported with the color data. But what do we do if we get a file in a format that doesn't have an alpha channel? We make one. Save our scene, then open Gimp. When it finishes loading, go to the File menu and open our image file. For this, we're going to use a logo on a white background, just to make it a bit more challenging. In the Image menu, select Mode and change it to Grayscale. That will make it much easier to work with. Under Colors, select Invert. It will create a negative image of the logo. We're going to use another item in the Colors menu. Select Levels. A box will appear with the slider and some other options. We're going to use the top slider. Adjust the pointers along that slider until your image is completely black and white, with just a little gray along the boundary between the brightest and darkest areas. Under the File menu, export this image as a JPG file with a different name than the original. Don't accidentally write over your original file. Close Gimp. If it asks you to save your file, just tell it to discard changes. That's only important if you're using the native Gimp file format. Reopen your file in Blender. Make sure to right-click on the rectangle that represents your image. Go to the Editor Type Selector icon at the bottom left of the 3D view and change it to Node Editor. You'll see a series of boxes, connected by what look like wires. To see how your changes will affect your object, open the Materials Properties tab and click on the little arrow in the Preview submenu. You'll see a preview of the material projected onto a sphere. In the node editor, you'll see that the image texture has two of the lines extending from it, one for color and one for alpha. The color connects to the emission shader, and the alpha connects to the factor input for the mix shader. But this image has no alpha data, so we need to replace that. Click on the image texture box to select it. Press Shift-D and move the mouse to another part of the window to duplicate it. Left-click to place the box. Left-click on the little circle next to the color on that box and drag it to the circle next to factor on the mix shader. In the preview window, you'll see that the image has changed and part of it is transparent. Click on the File folder icon next to the image file name and load in the mask we created in Gimp. Now the image has the proper transparency and can be rendered and saved, just as we did for the text we created earlier. Go back to the 3D view and press F12 to render our image. Press F3 to save the image with the new file name. Remember, it has to be a PNG image with the RGBA file type selected. In our next lesson, we'll see how to set up our files to output, then how to render the program.